If you had toast this morning, there's a real chance it came from one of 8 breads Florida just pulled off grocery store shelves and sent to a lab. Not 10, not a round number picked to sound impressive. 8, because that's what they actually tested. 6 came back positive for the active chemical in weed killer. My name is Barbara Cole. I spent 35 years inspecting food products at manufacturing plants across this country. My whole job was catching the gap between what a label promised and what was actually sitting inside the package. Manufacturers reformulate, suppliers change. Sometimes a recipe shifts and the packaging just never catches up. That gap was my entire career. Here's the part that should make you uneasy. You're going to recognize every single name on this list. What you won't recognize is who's actually behind half of them. 3 brands you'd swear have nothing to do with each other come from exactly the same place. I'll show you that partway through. But that's not even the part that bothers me most. Near the end of this list, there's a seal on some of these bags, the kind you trust without thinking twice about it, that isn't telling you what you think it's telling you. I'll show you exactly what it actually covers and what it doesn't before we're done. 2 of these 8 came back completely clean. I'm going to walk you through all 8, worst to best, exactly the way I'd have done it on the job, reading everything, assuming nothing. Stay with me. Let's start at the bottom. Sara Lee honey wheat, 191.04 parts per billion of glyphosate, the highest reading Florida found. Sara Lee has been in American kitchens a long time. Birthday cakes, holiday desserts, the name that shows up at family gatherings you can probably remember from childhood. That history is exactly why this result stings a little more than the others. A brand doesn't earn 70 years of trust by accident, and it doesn't lose your attention to a stranger's product. It loses it to its own label if you actually read it. Look at that bag before I say another word. Honey, right there on the front, in the name itself. In 35 years of reading labels for a living, I learned one rule that never once failed me. The bigger the word on the front of the package, the more carefully you need to check the back. A name is marketing. An ingredient list is the truth. Those are 2 different documents written by 2 different departments for 2 different purposes, and most people only ever read one of them. Here's something you can do yourself right now with whatever bread is already in your kitchen. Flip it over. Find where the actual sweetness comes from. On most breads like this one, it isn't honey doing the work. It's corn syrup sitting several lines down the ingredient list, quietly doing the job a nicer word up front got all the credit for. While you're back there, press the bag gently between 2 fingers. If it compresses down to almost nothing and springs right back with no resistance at all, that's worth noticing too. Real bread has some give to it, some structure. A loaf engineered to survive weeks sitting on a warehouse shelf behaves differently in your hand than one that wasn't built for that kind of shelf life. I'm not telling you what that means for you. I'm telling you it's worth feeling for yourself. Sara Lee is owned by Bimbo Bakeries USA, one of the largest baking companies in the world. Hold on to that name. We're coming back to it sooner than you'd think. Number 7. Nature's Own Butter Bread, 190.23 parts per billion. Close enough to the top result that calling it a near tie wouldn't be dishonest. Nature's Own is owned by Flowers Foods, one of the largest bread companies in America, doing billions of dollars a year in revenue. The name itself is doing a lot of work here. Natural, own. Something about that phrasing tells you this came from somewhere small and intentional, somewhere personal. That's not an accident either. That's what a brand name is built to do, and it's usually built by people who are very good at their jobs. There's a lawsuit right now, filed in 2025, alleging this brand's never any artificial preservatives claim doesn't hold up because of an ingredient called ascorbic acid sitting right there on the label, plain as anything. I want to be precise with you here because precision is the entire reason I'm standing here, instead of just handing you a scary headline and calling it a day. That's an allegation. It hasn't been decided in any court. Flowers Foods has denied it, and denial matters. I'm not going to pretend a company is guilty just because someone filed paperwork. But somebody filed that case because they read the same label you're about to read, and they didn't like what they found either. This is exactly the kind of gap I was trained to flag for 35 years, a claim printed on the front that doesn't fully square with what's printed on the back. not necessarily dishonest on purpose, just a gap that sat there long enough for someone to notice. Number 6, Wonder Bread Classic White, 173.19 parts per billion. Wonder Bread doesn't try to sell you organic or premium or artisanal. It sells you something different entirely. The loaf your grandmother trusted, the one that's been sitting on the kitchen counter of this country for generations, through decades most of us weren't even alive for. That kind of trust doesn't come from a lab result. It comes from just always being there, on every counter, in every lunchbox, for longer than almost any other product in the store. Pay close attention here, because this is the first real thread of tonight's video, and I promise you it gets bigger before we're through. Wonder Bread, also Flowers Foods, same parent company as the loaf we just finished talking about. 2 different names, 2 different bags, sitting 2 feet apart on the same shelf, dressed up with completely different colors and completely different stories, looking for all the world like 2 competing companies fighting for your cart. One company behind both of them the entire time. A shopper walking that aisle sees variety. What's actually sitting on that shelf is one company's portfolio wearing 2 different outfits to 2 different parties. Number 5, Nature's Own Perfectly Crafted White, 132.34 parts per billion. That's the second Nature's Own product to show up on this list tonight. Same Flowers Foods ownership as the 2 brands right before it. So of our 4 worst results so far, 3 of them came out of a single company's lineup, wearing 3 completely different names and sitting at 3 different price points on the shelf. I'm careful with the word coincidence because that's what you call something that only happens once. This happened 3 times in a row on 3 different bags at 3 different prices, marketed to 3 slightly different customers. That's not chance. That's a pattern. And noticing patterns exactly like that one, quietly, over years of doing the same careful reading, was my entire job for 35 years. I told you at the very start of this video that I'd stop partway through and show you something the lab numbers alone don't tell you. Here it is. Sara Lee, the worst result on this entire list, that's Bimbo Bakeries. Nature's Own and Wonder Bread, 3 of the results right behind it. That's Flowers Foods. Dave's Killer Bread, which we're about to get to, is also Flowers Foods. You didn't look at 8 different companies tonight. You mostly looked at 2. Here's how this actually happens in plain terms, because I think it's worth understanding rather than just accepting as a fact and moving on. A large food company almost never builds a brand new name from nothing and waits 30 or 40 years for people to learn to trust it. That's slow, and it's expensive, and there's no guarantee it works. It's far cheaper and far faster to simply buy a name people already trust, a legacy bakery, a beloved regional brand with decades of goodwill already built up, and let that existing trust keep doing the work it already earned under new ownership. What usually follows that kind of purchase is quiet. Same flour suppliers, often. Same wheat sourcing, often. The packaging stays familiar, sometimes barely changed at all. The founder's story, if there ever was one, usually stays right there on the bag, because that story is worth more to the new owner than it costs them to keep printing it. What changes is almost always the thing you can't see standing in the aisle, the supply chain sitting behind the label, quietly folded into everything else the parent company already runs at scale. I'm not telling you any of that is illegal. It isn't. It's not against a single regulation I ever enforced in 35 years on the job. But if 2 brands can share one owner without ever once saying so anywhere on the package, that raises a harder question worth sitting with. What else on that shelf isn't quite what it looks like? Hold on to that thought. I'm coming back to it before we're done tonight. We're a little past the halfway mark now. The next 3 results go in the other direction entirely, and then I'll come back and answer that question I just left hanging. Number 4, Dave's Killer Bread, White Done Right, 11.85 parts per billion. Fairness is the entire point of doing this properly, so let's be fair. That's a real drop. Not a small improvement over the brands above it, a genuine break from every single result we've covered so far. Dave's Killer Bread built its whole identity on being different from the rest of the bread aisle. Bold graphic packaging, a founder's redemption story printed right on the bag, organic certification. It's the brand health-conscious shoppers reach for without a second thought, the one nutritionists and trainers recommend, sitting in millions of kitchens because people genuinely believe they've already solved the bread problem. And on this particular result, that reputation actually holds up. Here's what's worth knowing though, because the full picture matters more than the flattering half of it. Dave's Killer Bread is also Flowers Foods, the same company we've been discussing all night. Flowers Foods acquired it back in 2015, and distribution expanded from a small regional Pacific Northwest operation to full nationwide shelves almost immediately afterward. The founder's story stayed exactly where it was on the bag. The supply chain behind it changed, and yet this particular result looks nothing like its siblings. That tells you something worth remembering long after this video ends. Ownership alone doesn't decide the outcome. A single company can run a genuinely cleaner operation on one brand and a dirtier one on another, right under the very same corporate roof. Number 3, Dave's Killer Bread, 21 whole grain and seeds, 10.38 parts per billion. The single lowest reading in Florida's entire test. Credit where it's due. That's a genuinely clean result, and I'm not going to take that away from them just because it's inconvenient for the rest of tonight's story. But I won't tell you only half of what I know about a brand, because that isn't how I was trained to do this job for 35 years. In 2026, Dave's Killer Bread settled a separate lawsuit over protein claims on its own packaging not meeting FDA labeling rules. Nothing to do with glyphosate whatsoever. A completely different issue. About a completely different number, printed on a completely different part of the bag. But a label is a label, whichever claim is sitting on it. A company can get the chemistry right on one front and get the honesty wrong on another, and both of those things can be true about the exact same brand at the exact same time. That's not a contradiction. That's just what a large company usually looks like, once you actually get close enough to look. Before I give you the last 2 results, I want to say something more important than any single number I've read you tonight. I can give you the exact figure for every one of these 8 products. What I can't give you is a certain answer on what that number means for your health. The EPA and the international agency that studies cancer risk don't even agree with each other on that question, and they've been looking at the same evidence for years. Anyone telling you they're completely sure, one way or the other, isn't being fully honest with you. I spent 35 years reading labels for a living, and I'm not going to start pretending I know something I don't, just to make this video more dramatic than the facts actually support. That's not the inspector I was, and it's not the kind of channel I want to run. Number 2, Sara Lee Artisano White, non-detect, nothing found at all. Same company, Bimbo, as the single worst result on this entire list. Completely different outcome from the exact same corporate parent made under the exact same roof somewhere in this country. Sit with that for a moment, because it's the clearest proof of everything I've told you tonight. The name on the front of a bag tells you almost nothing about what's actually inside it. Not the company behind it, not the number waiting for it in a lab somewhere. 2 loaves off the same corporate ledger, and about as different a result as you could possibly ask for. Number 1, Pepperidge Farm Farmhouse Hearty White, also non-detect. Pepperidge Farm has been baking since the 1930s. The red bag, the old-fashioned lettering, packaging designed to make you picture a stone farmhouse with a kitchen garden out back, rather than a production line running around the clock. And on this particular product, the result actually backs up the image the packaging is selling you. Here's something worth noting before we close this list out entirely. Pepperidge Farm is the one brand on this whole list not owned by Bimbo and not owned by Flowers Foods. It's owned by the Campbell Company, a completely different corporate parent, closing this countdown on the cleanest result we saw all night. Now I'm going to answer the question I left you holding on to earlier. What else on that shelf isn't quite what it looks like? Some of the organic breads sitting on shelves near these 8 carry a USDA organic seal. That seal is real, and it verifies something real. It confirms the grower didn't intentionally apply glyphosate to the crop. Here's what it doesn't verify, and this is the part almost nobody tells you. It says nothing about drift from a conventional field growing right next door, Herbicide sprayed on one farm doesn't stop politely at the property line just because the neighboring field happens to be certified. It says nothing about what happens once a small, beloved, family-founded brand gets quietly folded into a much larger company's supply chain. The exact same pattern I just walked you through tonight, with 3 separate names on this very list. The seal is honest about exactly what it covers. Most shoppers simply assume it covers more than it actually does. That gap between what a certification promises on the surface and what it actually checks underneath is exactly the kind of gap I spent 35 years of my working life finding. Not because companies are lying to you. Most of the time, they aren't. It's because nobody ever hands you a map of what a seal does and doesn't cover. Until tonight. 8 products. Not 10, not a scarier sounding number chosen to grab your attention. 8, because that's what was actually tested. 2 of them came back clean, 6 of them didn't. And most of what you looked at with me tonight came from 2 companies wearing 8 different names. I'm not going to tell you to never buy bread again. That's not what tonight's video was for, and it wouldn't be honest of me to say it. I'm going to tell you what I'd actually do, standing in that aisle myself. Flip the bag over before it goes in your cart. Count what's actually in it. Check who owns it before a familiar name convinces you of something the company standing behind it never actually promised you in writing. Tell me in the comments, which of these 8 is sitting in your kitchen right now? I read every single one of them, and I want to know which results surprised you the most tonight. Next time, I'm going to do this same kind of reading with something sitting in almost every kitchen in this country. Something that carries a seal most people trust completely without ever checking what it actually means, and one detail buried in the ingredient list that almost nobody ever catches. Read the label. That's all I ever did.